So we're going to be doing a presentation, a Veterans Day presentation with Mr. Sonny Fox, all the way from Los Angeles, California. And we are here at Jupiter Middle School in Jupiter, Florida. And welcome, Mr. Fox.
When I left service, we wore this when we left the service. And it's got some insignia on it, and I'm going to try to figure out whether you're going to be able to see it. First of all, can you read the stripes over here?
We can see the stripes.
Mr. Starr, can you see these?
Yes.
Okay, that means I was a sergeant. That means I was a non-commissioned officer. Commissioned officers were lieutenant up. Non-commissioned officers would be corporals, sergeants, and so on. So that was an NCO stripe. This, and can you read this? Can you see this red patch?
Not quite, a little lower, there you go.
Okay, that was my division insignia. I was in the 28th Division, and it's shaped like a keystone because it started out being the Pennsylvania National Guard. Then when the war broke out, it became a division and kept that keystone insignia, though almost nobody was left from Pennsylvania by the time I got to them. By being in the infantry, that meant I was carrying a rifle and moved into battle largely on foot. We had, mechanized troops, we had the Air Force, we had the Navy, we had a lot of different parts of this military activity. But I was a doughboy in World War I, they called them, but I was a GI in the trenches. Well, we're not trenches, we didn't use trenches. We used foxholes, not named after me, by the way, but they were called foxholes. These were individual holes that we dug down to kind of shield ourselves. And finally made our way down across the English Channel, across Omaha Beach, but fortunately quite a ways after the invasion. And then we were having to catch up with the war, which I did finally in a place called the Hurtgen Forest, which was not a good place to be. I knew that when we were replacements. We didn't go over as a division. We went over as just individuals to replace men who had fallen in battle, so to replace them. And that's why we were called replacements. So we were shipped across France, both by train and then by truck, until we caught up with the war. And by that time, it was pretty close to Germany, but they had paused there. They had to resupply, Patton had to resupply, get gasoline and fuel and food and so on, ammunition for the next push. So we caught up, but the Hurtgen Forest was sort of in Germany or in Belgium, and it was not a good place to be because the Germans were firing off artillery shells at tree level, designed to explode at tree level, which meant that the metal from the explosion was dispersed over a huge area. It didn't just land and affect a small area. And the result is the 28th, which had been in there for a long time, from the landings all the way across, was decimated. I knew how decimated it was when they organized us to go up and be the replacements in the Hurtgen Forest. And I looked around and there were about 100 of us going into one area. Now a company is about 240 men. So if we were going up as 100, that meant they had almost 50% casualties already. And then walking up the road to where we were going, coming down on the other side were guys with bandages in their heads and yelling about the 88s, the German artillery. He showed us where we were, which were slit trenches with ice water on the bottom, snow around us. And he said, "Here you are," and he left. He didn't even tell me where the Germans were, but I could figure out where the slit trench was facing. That's probably toward the Germans. When I went into my slit trench, there was a frozen body of an American soldier who had been killed, and they hadn't even gotten him out. So I had to remove him first before I occupied, and I hadn't even been in battle yet, and I was facing what was, what war looked like. It was cold and wet in that slit trench, and we all got frostbite on our feet because of that, but I had to sleep in that soggy, wet thing every night for as long as we stayed up there. We stayed up there for 2 or 3 more weeks, no fires and no comfort, and in that icy water every night until it was time to move us out. And then we were replaced by another division. I can't remember which one it was. So that was my first sense of my battle, which was a terrible place to have to enter into battle. Times at one point we got ambushed by Germans, and I got sort of trapped in a beet furrow because that was the only place I could think to hide. And all the rest of my men, because I had been the last one out when I took them out, and I said, everybody get out and go over to there. And I was made sure everybody was out. So I was the last one. And then the Germans came over with their automatics and saw one guy, that was me, and they all took aim. And so I flopped into the beet furrow, which is only maybe 8 inches deep, but it felt like a secure place to me. And then finally I realized when a bullet went between my arm and my chest, and later I realized it had ripped part of my underwear, I figured this is not a good place to be. So off I went to join the others and made it. And we had, by the way, no radio, no telephone, no communications at all with the town. So I had no idea what was going on. And this went on hour after hour after hour. And by about 3 in the afternoon, I heard tanks coming down the road from the town toward me, toward our position. I had no idea if they were German tanks or our tanks. Well, they turned out to be our tanks. And now they were my tanks, without any communications with the town or anything, but they sent me 2 tanks to reinforce my position. Pretty good for a kid from Brooklyn of 18 years old, 19 years old now. So I deployed my tanks, and then a ranger squad showed up and was put under my command. Now I had my squad and the ranger squad and 2 tanks. Pretty good. And while I was waiting to be appointed field marshal, I deployed them around and figured out where the fire was coming from and tried to return it, and spent a night there. The next morning I was standing with one of the tankers. His top was up. We were looking around toward the town where some of the action was going on. And I said, we were getting sniper fire. I said, I don't know where it's coming from. Why don't you machine gun down there? Maybe they're down there. So he was laying down a fusillade. In the meantime, way over on the other side of the town, maybe 800 yards away, or maybe further than that even, 2 tanks came up on the hill. And he had his field glasses on them, and I was standing near the tank, and I said, theirs or ours? He said, square fenders, theirs. And to confirm that, the turret of one of the tanks came around, facing us, and fired. Now, this is the story of the shortest tank battle in World War II. I'm standing about 15 yards away from the tank, and the shot hits the turret. If the shot hits the turret of our tank square on, we're not having this conversation. But it hit it on an angle and glanced off about 100 yards away and exploded, with which the tanker in the tank I was next to clanged his turret shut, revved up the engine, banked in the kitchen of my farmhouse, and took off. And the other tank did the same thing. And now 2 tanks were scurrying away from what was the shortest tank battle in World War II, 1 shot. And the battle was over. The Germans had broken through the lines. Right north of us, a new division, the 106, had come on 6 days earlier for the first time. They had never been battle tested. And the Germans just sliced right through them. And as a result, we had held our position, but we were now about 35 miles behind German lines. Our regiment had already gone down. Division had signed off. We were really 35 miles behind the German lines with no way out. So Captain Freiker said, we're going to come out with our hands raised at 11 o'clock, destroy. So we burned the Jeeps and we took out the sear pins from our guns so they couldn't be used. And we did come out with our hands raised. And now I was a prisoner of war. So Erwin Fox from Brooklyn, New York, it was now a German captive. Anyway, 3 days, most of 3 nights, we walked with no food or water, I might say, to a railroad siding. And there were freight trains. These are freight trains that were known as 40 and 8s, either 40 men or 8 horses. That was the all 40 and 8s. I was given a shovel, and another GI next to me was given a shovel, and we were told to get on one of the box cars and shovel out the manure from whatever animals had been in there. So we did. And then we became the animals, and not 40, but 75 in each box car, with not enough room for everybody to lie down. So then we were locked into that boxcar, and for what I remember 7 days and 7 nights, others remember maybe 5 days and 5 nights, a little vague on that. But we were locked into that boxcar with no food, no water, and a bitterly cold January or late December.
If you want, you can continue because you're at such a dramatic point. Why don't you just continue?
All right. Okay. Anybody who wants to interrupt me at any time, raise your hand, please. I'm open to that. Okay. So we get off, and there's a series of makeshift desks on this. Now, remember, we haven't eaten or drunk for about a week, and I'm cold, and it's very cold. And so I want to get into whatever the building is and get a little warm and hopefully get some food. But you have to check in. Germans are very thorough about that. And fortunately, I had an American clerk who had already been captured, and the Germans had employed him to help them. Let me take this off. And so he said, your name, rank, and serial number, of course, which is okay. He said, your father's name. I said, you know, I'm only supposed to give you name, rank, and serial number. He says, hey, kid, if you don't give me this, stand out in the snow until you're ready. Well, I figured if I told him my father's name was Julius Fox, that wouldn't matter very much. And he was a textile tycoon, businessman. That wouldn't lose the war. So I gave him that. Then I heard a question I wasn't expecting to hear, because he said religion. Now, I know I'm in Germany. I'm very well aware what the Germans are doing to the Jews and have done to the Jews. So I'm not naive about this. But I had surrendered already once, and I think I didn't want to surrender again. So I said to him, Jewish. And he looked at me, this American, he said, Protestant. And I reaffirmed Jewish. He said, Protestant, get in there. So I got in there. And it turned out that at that prison camp, anybody who had a Jewish name, they didn't think Fox was, anybody with a Jewish name got separated and put a different barrack. Now, here is a remarkable story. And as a matter of fact, I'm going into New York, and on December 3rd, there's a new documentary that's going to depict what I'm about to tell you happened. We had 4 different barracks of American prisoners with about 240 each in each barrack. That was about 1,200 prisoners that were Americans. We had in one of the barracks, not mine, a top 6 striper. That is he was the top sergeant. You couldn't get any higher than that in the non-commissioned rank. So the Germans used him as their point person to send messages to the Americans and get them to do what they wanted. And one day they came to him and they said, tomorrow morning, we want you to have all the Jewish prisoners standing outside of their barracks. The word came down to us, as it did, I never knew from where, but we got the word from this man named Roddy Edmond, whom I didn't even know existed at that time, that when they say fall out tomorrow morning, everyone falls out, not just the Jew, everyone. So we all fell out that next morning. Now, what took place out of my earshot, out of my eyes sight, in front of another barracks. But a dear friend of mine whom I met after we got out of prison camp was standing next to Roddy. And he is still alive, a couple of years older than I am, and he knows about this because he heard it. the Germans came to him and looked at the group and he said, "These can't all be Jews." Roddy said, "We are all Jews." Excuse me. He put a gun to his head, a Luger to his temple, to Roddy's temple, and said, "I want you to tell me who are the Jews." And Roddy repeated, "We are all Jews," putting his life at risk. Now, Roddy was from Pennsylvania, not Jewish, and he risked his life. And the Hauptmann took his gun down from his revolver, and Roddy saved probably about 200 Jewish lives there that day at our prison camp. And that's what this new documentary is about that I'll be seeing on December 3rd in New York. And that was a story I did not know at that time. Now, the other thing about prison camp is this. When you first become a prisoner, a sense of helplessness makes you limp. You can't affect anything. You can't make anything happen. You can't change anything. You sort of lie there inertly. After a few weeks, maybe 3 or 4 weeks, an older, he was 28, POW, chose me. And I don't know why he chose me. I have no idea. He said, "I want you to do 2 things. I want you to shave, and I want you to wash your socks." And that doesn't sound like a very large challenge from where you sit. There was one razor for 240 men and one razor blade. No hot water. You had to go outside to the outhouse and nothing but cold water. I undertook those 2 tasks. I went out to the outhouse with this lousy razor and with only cold water at hand, I shaved. Now, fortunately, our hair came in much smoother and lighter than it does normally. But still in all, every time I cut a hair follicle, I brought tears to my eyes. It may have taken me 20 minutes standing in that cold outhouse in January, cold in Germany, to finish shaving. Then I had to take these socks and in only cold water in the outhouse, wash them. Then I put them back and put them on the pot stove in the barracks. Now, what I had done by doing those 2 things, I took back control of my life. I was no longer a limp victim. Now I was in control of my life. And I started to do things that I hadn't even thought about before. We actually were in a concentration camp. It was a concentration camp that had been evacuated. I do not know what happened to the population. If they were Jews, they were probably killed, but eventually they used this for POWs. We got the exact same diet that they had had. Every day from the time I entered in the prison camps, we got breakfast was a cup of soup. A cup of tea. Lunch was a cup of dubious soup. And dinner was a loaf of ersatz bread, which is probably half sawdust, divided between or among 10 men. So tea in the morning, soup in the afternoon, and a piece of ersatz bread at night was our total diet every day. When I walked into the prison camp, I was 160 pounds. When I walked out 3.5 months later, I was 106 pounds. We knew that the war was coming to an end. We could even hear first of all, because we got the news, but then we could hear Corps guns, which meant that they were within maybe 20 miles. And the Germans were getting very nervous about that, very nervous. They didn't want to be caught in a prison camp with prisoners. So they announced one night that the next morning, everybody was moving out of the camp. They were moving them deeper and deeper into Germany. Word came down, and I guess it was from Roddy, that we were to make plans accordingly as to how not to move out. And the plans was something like this. 1/3 of us were chosen, and we had to do this ourselves, to stay in the bed. And when they said, "Raus," and get out, they were going to say, "Well, I'm too sick to move." That was one third. Another third, when they moved us out to where it was cold and rainy and waiting for the gate to open to move us out, when they said move out, a third of those people that were left, a third of our POWs, were to drop on the wet ground, the wet cold ground, and say they couldn't move. And if indeed they still took the last third of us out, we were organized into groups of 10. And I was in one of those. And when we got nightfall, if we were on the road, we were to jump a guard. 10 of us were each to jump a German guard. Highly speculative proposition. I'm glad I didn't have to do it. But the whole point was we didn't want to move out because the Americans were shooting up everything that was moving on the roads. And we were in very bad shape to do very much anyway. We were all pretty well weakened by that diet we were on. And it was cold and wet out there. So we had to organize ourselves. And the next morning, the Germans came in. And the first third of those people said, "I'm too sick to get out." And the Germans started waving their lugers around, but they held their ground. And finally left them behind in the barracks. And the rest of us were out there in this sort of just misty, cold weather. We were left standing there, and they said, "Okay, move out." And our guys started dropping in the cold. And I started giggling because I couldn't believe it was going on so well. I mean, they were really doing it. And finally, the Germans were getting more and more anxious to get the heck out of that camp. And they turned and said, "Well, just give me a couple of hundred of the guys so I can move some of you out." I said, "Nope." And finally, they left us. They scurried away. And we went back to our barracks and became very, very quiet. Because the German army, the defeated German army, the disorganized, defeated German army was now passing by our place. And you don't know, a disorganized army is not a good thing because there's no discipline in that. So we remained very quiet and out of sight. We wanted them to think that the entire camp was indeed deserted. And then when it seemed like there was nobody left and no Germans, I climbed on the roof of our barracks and I watched two rows of tanks, American tanks, coming down the hills. It was Patton's army, 6th Armored Division, coming down. At which point I got out and climbed up to the roof of our barracks so I could really see this whole thing. Well, that's where I was up already. So I could see this whole thing. And then the first American troops, I think from the 80th Division, came in a Jeep. And my reaction, I remember saying this, is, "My God, they're fat." Because they weren't fat. We were thin. And so on the 28th of March, 1945, we were liberated and eventually found my way home. And we had a song that we used to sing in the prison camp. And I think I'll try to get through it. I remember it very well. "We're a bunch of Yankee soldiers living deep in Germany. We eat black bread, a little soup, a beverage they call tea. And we have got to stay right here till Patton sets us free. And we can, rolling home, come and get us, Georgie Patton. Come and get..." Well, he came and he got us, and we did go rolling home. So there you are. That was my personal war in World War II. Now, first say, I can't believe after all these decades, when I recount this story, that it still affects me like it did today, telling you about it. It lies deep.